He has committed himself to instilling leadership and coaching and training principles that he values to develop individuals and institutions to be the best that they can be. He's not simply the journalist, he's not simply the anchor, he's not simply the professional football player, he's not simply a wonderful husband and father to his family. Mr. Tillman is a special, hardworking, honorable man, and we are so fortunate to have him here today. Thank you, Mr. Tillman.
Good night, everyone. We'll see you back next Tuesday. It's been great to see you all. Thank you. We'll get you to your flight in the morning.
Thank you, Hugh, and more importantly, thank you, Gina. That was outstanding. It was long, but it was outstanding. It was very good, though. But I did a lot of notes with respect to your company and what you guys do, so if I don't get home in time enough, my wife actually may be seeking you for service. No, it's good. That was all good. Thank you so much, Gina. I appreciate it. I want to thank Hugh, Gina, and Patrick for the courtesy that they've shown, Brian as well, everybody that accompanied us over the facility today. It was good to kind of be in that environment to see how people respond to, I'm going to call it a crisis, one loss. And with 2 years, you've had 3 losses in that time frame. That's incredible. And some people have kind of been out of shape looking for more. But needless to say, we'll talk a little bit about football, but I won't major on that too much. I came here to really talk about leadership. I came here to talk about it in the context of a particular type of situation. But before we do that, as a way of introduction with Gina's comments, I've not heard anybody say so many kind things to me at once, at a single time. I've got 4 daughters, right? And I think Patrick even chuckled when I told you that I've got 4 daughters. And it reminded me of my dad when I first told him we had the 4th one in the oven. I was trying to get the boy, right? So I call him up on the phone. You got to know my dad. He's an understated guy from East Texas. And I say, Pops, we got another one in the oven. And there was this, no pun intended, there was this pregnant pause. And he says, boy, don't you have cable TV? And I said, yes, sir. I said, yes, sir, I'm trying to get the boy, So there was this kind of pause. It was uncomfortable. But my dad said, well, I don't know if you need to keep trying or not, but I would kind of slow down if I were you. But we were trying to get it because the girls are great. But it'd be nice, and I know, Pat, you've got 2 boys, but it's kind of neat to kind of be able to pal around with your sons, and that's kind of the thing I was looking for. So as we were making our way over, I was kind of jealous of your situation, being able to hang out with the boys. It's kind of cool stuff. I can have them anytime I want to. I know they've got a lot of energy, but that's good. But the girls are ornery too sometimes, guys. They can really give it to you. I remember maybe a couple of years ago, we went back to New York City to see WABC, where I kind of got my network broadcasting career before we got up to the major network level. And WABC is the #1 rated local affiliate in the nation. So here we go back, and I noticed a couple of people that, from the olden days, and they recognized me. And my daughter, Bailey, at the time was only like 13 or 14. So she's kind of doodling around as kids are wont to do. And she's got a lollipop in her mouth and she's playing around. And so the family comes over and we talk about maybe 5 or 6 minutes. And when they leave, Bailey kind of looks at me and she goes, well, why did they want your autograph? You ain't nobody. And I said, well, you know that and I know that, but maybe they don't know that, so they did. So the girls give me a hard time as well. I have no reprieve, so that's the reason why I want the boys. So you can go hang out with them. You talk about the same things, the same kind of fun things that all dads tend to have in common with their young boys. So that said, I want to talk to you a little bit about young men and women as well, because leadership is something that is universal. We certainly have a dearth of it in this nation. That's what some of the research tells us. I've had the pleasure of spending the last 2.5 years working hand in hand with Gallup on this issue of the millennial cohort. They are a very interesting breed, and to be quite candid with you, captains of industry are scared to death of how they're ultimately going to lead. They are the products of 2 wars, economic crisis, and there's a lot of bad things, right, that influence their decisions and what they truly value in life. Let me give you a case in point. I've been studying the millennial cohort, and I've been working with several people from Gallup. One of them took really particular close interest to what we were doing, as we work a lot with the Lombardi Award, which is kind of a leadership-centric award. And Jim Clifton, the CEO of Gallup, and by the way, I recommend his book highly, The Coming Jobs War. It's a great articulation of what the problems are and then what our response should be as a result. So I became just enamored with this kind of phenomenon with these young people and why they were wired the way that they were wired. And here's the long and short of it. He told me to start taking a notepad everywhere I went so that I could record notations with respect to how they behaved in a particular situation. So I think the best way to communicate this is to tell you a story, and it's kind of a longer introduction, but it does set the table. So it dawned on me one night about 9:30, I have just gotten through working out at LA Fitness, and I come up to this Subway, and I'm going to get a Subway sandwich, right, a little $5 Subway sandwich, tuna fish sandwich. And I pull up, and I notice this kid was working in there. It was about 9:30 at night. They close at 10 o'clock. He sees the headlights on my car, and he darts behind the partition that was separating the food prep area from the area where he was working. So there, if you can imagine, there's a wall here. And so my lights are out there, and he's looking behind the wall to see if I'm still there. I stay in my car for 17 minutes, and that kid hid for about 16 of those minutes until we got about close to the top of the hour, 10 o'clock. Now, it's funny, we kind of chuckle at it, but this was really an extension of some of the research we had been doing and that Gallup had been conducting, and it has something to do with my subject that I want to share with you, and I'll open it up to questions afterwards. And I'm going to also kind of unpack the role that coaching and influencing and leadership has to do with all of this. So back to our kid. So he sees my headlights, he darts, and then I wait for nearly 17 minutes. And near the end of that time, I get out of the car, and I go tap on the glass. And by then, he's making his way out, because now he's in a tenable position to say, we're closed, right? It's 10 o'clock. And I mouthed at him, I said, hey, would you make me a sandwich? And he pointed up to the clock, just like I anticipated, and said, we're closed. I said, great. I get in my car, go home, and I get on the internet, and I do exactly what Jim Clifton told me to do. I found out that there were 37,000 subways in the United States of America and on military bases around the world. Track with me on this. I'm going someplace, I promise you. So I did the math on it, and it came up to $185,000. If every millennial that's occupying one of those positions decided not to make a sandwich in that moment, here's why that's important and why it's likely to happen. For the first time in our nation's 240-year history, this is the largest cohort that, because of socioeconomic events, tend to think alike more so than any other generation that has preceded them. Millennials tend to have the same core values more so than my generation, our generation, and the generation that precedes them. Now that's, you say, well, big deal. It's problematic, and here's why it's the case. The context of the times that they're being raised in are totally different than the context of the times that you and I were raised in. Pack with me on this. I grew up when there were 290 million people in America, give or take. There are about 340 or so now. We didn't really worry about people in Bangalore, India, and China collaborating and being able to compete. They didn't have the technological advancement at the time. They certainly didn't have the educational piece as well. So for all intent and purposes, this was our competitive group, right? Now page 4, Thomas Friedman and all those slick cats that write about these things, the great book he wrote, The World is Flat, they were dead on. Not only are these kids in Bangalore, India, and China able to collaborate and compete. Remember the refrain when you were growing up and your parents used to tell you to eat all your food because the kids over in Africa are starving and they don't have food, right? Well, the refrain today should be sure and do your homework. Yeah, we want you to eat your food too, but do your homework because the kids in Bangalore, India, and China are doing theirs, and they're hungrier for opportunity than you are. And the first time ever in the world, and certainly in our nation's 240-year history, they have the technology and access to education to allow them to collaborate and compete. The book that Gina mentioned that I wrote for Thomas Nelson Publishers called Scoring in the Red Zone, Leading Successfully When the Pressure's On. I did that, and I wrote it. The gentleman who edited the book I've never met in my life. That wasn't my call necessarily, it was Thomas Nelson. They did it because of economic reasons. Some of you may remember just a couple of days ago that Disney just cut 300 people, right? 300 timers that were in their 50s, and some of them were six-figure folk. They were making big-time money, but they were part of the reason why the company was able to thrive and become the centerpiece for the Disney franchise itself. I mean, that was the profit center, right? The economics changed, and so they managed for shareholder value, and then the landscape has been completely changed. That's becoming more frequent in our culture, and that's really the essence of what I came to share with you about. If I were given this talk a title, it would be just that, Scoring in the Red Zone. Leading successfully when the pressure is on. And if you don't think the pressure is on, hang on to these numbers. According to Gallup, there are 7 billion people on planet Earth. And of those 7 billion, 5 billion are adults age 15 and older. And of those 5 billion, 3 billion tell Gallup they are either full-time formally employed or seeking full-time formal employment. Hang with me. The problem is there are only 1.8 billion full-time formal jobs created as of the 30th of last month in the world, period. Full-time formal, defined as 30 hours a week or more with a steady paycheck. These are global numbers. We're not the 40-hour number. This is an aggregate of the world. So 30 hours a week or more with a steady paycheck. There are only 180,000 full-time formal jobs in the world. If you do the math, that leaves us with a 1.2 billion shortfall. So now we have, and here's the problem, here's the rub. You have an increasingly larger number of people who, because of information technology, have access to compete and to collaborate for a shrinking number of positions. Imagine this. Jeff was up here a minute ago. Is he gone yet?
Yeah,
Jeff, he's gone. Okay, Jeff is gone. He was talking about football a minute. If I went to training camp back in the day, there may have been 12 guys in training camp. You know what? I went to Oklahoma when Oklahoma was running back U. Billy Sims, Heisman Trophy, Greg Pruitt. For you guys, old hands have been around longer than that. Well, Marcus Dupree. Okay, I signed after Marcus Dupree. I'm confident. I'm not scared. I'm going to make it, right? That hubris, that arroganceness, you right? That's part of that whole deal. Guess what? Imagine if there were 5,000 running backs in training camp that I had to compete for. I could go there with that hubris if I wanted to, but the difficult truth is I would likely be on the streets eventually because somebody in that group, probably more than 12 of them, would be as good, if not better than I. And probably some of them would be willing to work. I know we're talking about college, so we don't get paid at college. But some of them, like our counterparts in the real world, would be willing to work cheaper for that opportunity. So you see, the narrative that we're painting here is a very difficult one. And sport, and here's where the connection comes into play. You said, I didn't know we were getting a socioeconomic lesson here. It's not. What it is, it's a lesson about preparing our young people to collaborate and compete in a totally different context. They are in a red zone. How do you know they're in a red zone? You know you're in a red zone when the need to achieve an objective is immediate. The obstacles between you and those objectives are growing more formidable. It's not just 290 million that you're competing against, it's billions of people that you're competing against. And that has real implications. So the need to achieve an objective is immediate, the obstacles are formidable, the options available to us are limited, and time is certainly running out. Those are the definitions that define a red zone. You say, well, what does that have to do with me and our kids and what you're talking about, raising them? Well, the onus, the challenge on people in positions of leadership like Jimbo Fisher and others, parents especially, you have to operate aware of the context of the times, that they haven't in fact changed. And therefore they require a totally different, at least a more acute awareness of those attributes in order to effectively navigate in that context, okay? Think of it in these terms. We talked about what it was like to compete in the context where there's a handful of running backs in the old days versus thousands of running backs in those days, in today's present time. That is a real deal. But most people aren't able to comprehend what is required to change. Does my training have to change? Will I have to run faster? Do I have to change my diet? What edge can I get? What action must I take in order to collaborate and compete more effectively in this new context? Well, one thing is particularly true. If we do not operate like a quarterback does when he comes to the line of scrimmage, the first thing he's trying to do is identify where the threats are, right? Where are the threats? We can see them. We just talked about some of the socioeconomic squeezes. Then that quarterback is going to call a play or a series of plays that gives him the best chance to succeed against that perceived threat. And then lastly, they've got to execute the play every single day. One of the phrases that Jeff mentioned earlier, he said that they are current, not constant problems. He was referring to whether the issue was at quarterback, whether it was at another skill position. They are current problems, but they're not constant problems. Well, the issues that govern the millennial cohort today are constant problems. It is the new normal, and it is not going to change anytime soon. So we have a choice. We either adapt or we die. Bill Walsh, and I was told you guys like football stories, Bill Walsh came up with this concept, and he understood these realities that we're talking about right now many years ago. And he came up with the concept called the red zone. You guys ever heard of the red zone before? What's the red zone? I just want to see if you're still engaged. Make sure. 20-yard line, right? Which you would be shocked to probably know that when he came up with the concept, it had nothing whatsoever to do with football. And he told me this personally. We're sitting on the wharf in San Francisco. This is shortly before he was diagnosed with cancer. He invited me out. I'm retired now in my professional career. And he began to develop another type of relationship with me that was not like a coach-player relationship. And what I learned during that time period was absolutely golden. He said, Spencer, you know where it came from? I said, no, Coach, tell me. He said, it came from me trying to understand what's happening when we get in this restricted place called the red zone. It has nothing to do with football. Yes, we do know that the field constricts from 6,500 square yards to 1,300. And it has a profound impact on the selection of plays that we can call. He says, but what I was trying to do was somehow get my players to understand that there had to be a physiological response to that situation, a psychological response to the changing demographics or the changing context of their times. And if they didn't, we were going to continue to lose games because the 49ers were awful at the time when he came up to the red zone. And how I knew that methodology worked is one day I was watching some film, and he showed me the timeline of when he began to talk about the red zone. When that guy in our training camp blew the horn and he said, red zone, red zone. Bill Walsh was brilliant because he always stacked the red zone preparation period at the end of practice. Why did he do that? Because he knew that if we didn't execute well, practice would continue indefinitely. And we also picked that up intuitively, instinctively. So he always put it at the end of practice, okay? Bill Walsh was trying to create this kind of a Pavlovian response mechanism so that when we heard the horn, you would literally see guys get up off their helmets and young guys talk to the older guys, hey man, pay attention, pay attention. What Bill Walsh was trying to do was tap their core values. The core value was freedom. We wanted practice to end so we could go do what we wanted to do, right? He understood that. So he was trying to induce, if you will, some kind of way where he could extract the best performance out of us in that situation. And we became one of the most efficient teams in operating in the red zone in the history of the National Football League. To this day, our 80% efficiency in terms of scoring touchdowns when we get there is still number one to this day. Because there was a methodology, there was an understanding of the context of our times to begin with, and there was a plan, an intentional decision, and a course that we were going to follow to affect the kind of change because the context has changed. And the old rules no longer apply. We would either have to adapt or we would die. The problem with our kids today is that the world has changed. The context, the rules of competition has changed. And we're either going to adapt or we're going to die. We can no longer afford to bring bows and arrows to what's become a gunfight. And professional sports, collegiate sports, high school sports is the best place, bar none, to teach these concepts and these principles. You don't have to believe me. The research, a recent study out of Harvard, supports this. It talks about combining the mental skills of being able to deal with physical threats, emotional threats, which every athlete knows and understands instinctively about that, and directly connecting it to long-term success in life. In fact, the conclusion was straightforward. That resiliency is more reliable an indicator of why a person or if a person will succeed much more than even academic prowess. That would blow your mind, but it's true. It's true. And it even becomes more so true. Now, we're not saying that academics are not important. They can be a measure of success. But what will determine moving forward whether or not we succeed or fail is our ability to fail and get back up. Fail and get back up. Because there's more people able to compete. And the numbers tell the story. Unless we're resilient, unless we have capacity to compete, we're not going to survive long term. When I was growing up, I used to hear my dad talk about it. And in fact, I remember the clock. 45 years working at the same place. He got his clock, he retired, and it was just great, right? I remember that as a kid. Well, guess what? The average person today is going to have between 9 and 11 jobs before they reach retirement age. I remember my mom used to tell my sister, does he have a steady job? You'd be talking about the boyfriends, right? They wanted to know if he has it, how long has he had the job? Well, guess what? We still want him to have a job. But today, it's 3 and see ya. Somebody's flipping that company, they're moving on. Now, there are some exceptions to every rule, but the bottom line is, the old methodology, the old way of approaching success in life has to be altered somewhat because the context and the conditions have changed. We almost wear job mobility as a badge of honor these days. Able to take our assets and become portable, to move them wherever we need to move them. You know, I was fortunate, I only played for 2 teams, but I know guys who played for 5, 6, 7, 8 teams, and you learn to become comfortable being uncomfortable. No one likes to be able to have to be uprooted and move from one place to the next. It happens. That is the new normal. So now, I kind of gave you a lot of kind of heady stuff there, but let me just kind of get it down to the point of why I really came here to share with you. I love coming back here to Tallahassee because you guys are not afraid of faith. And you understand the role that a relationship with God has to do with all of this. How many of you know the Bible says, be anxious for nothing, but in everything through prayer and supplication, we are to let our requests be made known to God, and the peace that surpasses all, not some, not a little bit, but all understanding, will guard your hearts and mind through Christ who strengthens you. As a son of a missionary, I believe that, and I practice that. I remember as a kid, my mother telling me, Spencer, she would always tell us these stories. And she would always tell the one about the passage where it says, as the sun and the rain comes down from heaven and waters the seed and causes it to bring forth after its own kind, so shall my word be. The word will not, it cannot return void until it has achieved the purpose unto which it was sent. And she would say, do you know what that means, Pimpy? That was my little nickname. I said, no ma'am, I don't. And she would explain it to me. She said, you need to understand that God has so arranged the affairs of nature that if you were to take a seed and you put it in the ground, you water it, you nurture it, and the sun kisses it, the seed really has no choice in the equation. It must do what it was designed to do. We have a role to play. Our young children that are growing up today are growing up in some very difficult times, but we're going to have to continue to nurture. We're going to have to continue to understand the context of the situations that they're being grown up in, if you will. Because if we don't, they will surely be choked out by the vicissitudes of life, which are more intense than they ever have been in world history. It's not an option. It's something that we have to do. But first of all, we've got to do like that quarterback and understand that that is the case and warrants a reaction as such. I remember some time ago, in New York City, before I went to WABC and actually signed for them, they were recruiting us. And I decided to retire from football. And WABC TV, Bart Fader was the general manager's name, asked me to come and take a look at a job that they were offering me. And I said, okay, Bart, I'll come, because I was employed with KPRC TV, the NBC affiliate in Houston. And so I went to New York, and I remember sitting in the front row at Lincoln Center. And I've actually heard since that there were several other people that were there and have told a similar story, but I'm going to tell you the story from my perspective as I close, as a way of kind of giving us the impetus to embrace this idea that the world indeed has changed and it's going to require a totally different set and a more intense response to those changes. So I'm sitting there in row 4, and Itzhak Perlman. Have you guys ever heard of Itzhak Perlman, the noted violinist, brilliant violinist? I'm 4 rows deep. And Itzhak Perlman began this concerto. There was a pianist that was accompanying him. And about maybe 2 movements in, the G string on the Stradivarius broke. And the place, because of the acoustics, you could hear it. It was like a pin drop. And you heard the mumbling. People were wondering what he was going to do. Well, this was a Stradivarius. It's not like you have another one in the back that's going to sound just like it. So everybody was nervous. Now, I grew up in a musical family, but I grew up in North Tulsa, Oklahoma. We broke as the 10 Commandments. We didn't know what a Stradivarius was. But all these years later, I'm sitting there, and this guy's string breaks. And I'm 4 rows deep, and he looked, I remember him looking up in the air, and he paused for a minute. And then, first of all, to appreciate this, you got to understand Itzhak Perlman's predicament. You see, he suffers from polio as a child, and he walks with the braces, right? And he always insists that he not be seated before he performs. And that's always uncomfortable for people who are well-heeled. And I thought that was kind of something majestic about the whole situation. For me, I enjoyed it, as again, I didn't come from much in North Tulsa. So he made his way out, and he's unaccompanied, and he slides with that kind of polio slide, and he gets to his position, and he undoes the clasp on his boots. And he folds his right leg back, and he extends the left leg to anchor himself to get ready to play. And then he began to play. And then, as I said, a couple of movements in, the string broke. And he paused for about 20 seconds. And he looked at the conductor, and then he pointed his bow at him to begin again. And the conductor began again. And what was delivered was one of the most brilliant presentations, giftings that I've seen personally in my life. He was able to coax from that now 3-string Stradivarius never before heard sounds. But if you know anything about music, it's impossible to complete a symphonic work with 3 strings. You can't do it. But what the message I'm trying to communicate today is the one that he demonstrated in real time on that day. See, he had been in that situation before and had practiced the difficult times. He had been in those scenarios where all hell broke loose, in a private room without consequences, not in a jam-packed theater or in Lincoln Center in New York City. And he began to prepare himself in those moments. And so after he did what he did, the crowd just erupted in applause. I mean, they went absolutely crazy. And they applauded for about 1.5 minutes when he finally stopped them again. And he used that bow and he pointed at them to kind of silence them. And then he reached in his back pocket and he pulled out a handkerchief and he wiped his forehead. And here's what he said. He said, you know, sometimes it is the artist's task to do his best work with what he has left. And I thought about that a moment, and I said, you know, that's a very powerful and prudent lesson, one that we need to communicate to our youth today. Because who knows when we get thrust into foreign territory, when we lose a job, who knows when we are facing sudden loss, the death of a loved one. I remember sometime 3 years ago, I'm sitting there on the set at CBS, and my phone rang just as the music, dun, 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 dun. We're getting ready to go on. There's 3.5 million people. They're going to see this show, and I look at my note, and it's my sister telling me that my brother Philippe had died of a heart attack. And those moments, you say to yourself, what are you going to do? If you're sitting at home, you probably didn't know. I probably had one of the best performances I've ever had in that context. It wasn't because of the tragedy, it was in spite of the tragedy. The preparation occurred long before that moment. Just last week, Tim Brando and I had the misfortune, but yet the experience nonetheless, of walking past a scene that was so tragic, as we call the Oklahoma State game. We saw the 3 bodies there with the bags and the sheets laying over them. And I thought about the families, and I thought about, the game was inconsequential. That didn't matter. It was insignificant at that point. But I was concerned for my partner because he's wired a little bit different than I am. He is a person, you know, emerging in his faith, but I'm an old hand. You know, I've had the grizzled missionary mom and the dad who was a quiet but steady presence. I've been taught from the time I was a little kid how to handle those situations. Oh, death, where is thy sting? I had the narrative inside of me. I knew how to deal with that, but I watched him struggle with it. And so I walked arm in arm with him the rest of the way. And we went in and we did the show. And we got applause and rave reviews from the people back in Los Angeles for the job that we did. But I have news for you, and this is really the message that I came to tell you. The victory was already won long before that incident happened. The game was inconsequential, all right? The crisis doesn't make the person. It merely exposes what's already there. And if we've not prepared ourselves to compete in the new context, whatever it may be, whatever fashion, whatever context it may be, we're going to be greatly disappointed in ourselves as we move forward. But through this great conduit called sport, we have access to the context, the situations, being thrust into foreign territory, sudden loss, mentoring relationships. The research tells us those are the 3 most important favorable contexts for the best kind of learning to take place. And they take place in sport. You see, the problem I've experienced in business and in life, you may go 6, 8 months, a year, and the person who's supposed to be your boss may not even tell you how good a job you've done. But it matters when they do. And it also matters when they're able to correct you with love in real time so that you can improve and advance and get better, and then you can pay it forward. All of these things matter. And you're probably thinking to yourself as I close here, boy, I wasn't expecting that kind of a talk. I was speaking more football stories and things of that nature. Let me tell you something, that's what football is. Football is life. It's an extension and a reflection of it. If you want to know the real value of sport, is that it reflects what's happening in the broader context of society. How can Appalachian State 7 years ago knock off Michigan? How does that happen in the big house? How does Georgia Tech, who lost 5 straight games, right, come in and knock a team who's 2 years removed from a national title, and less than 2 years removed from a national title, that's got one of the greatest running backs they've had in many, many, many years. Great defense, athleticism, and all of that. Forget about the inconsistencies at quarterback. That's not it. Defense wins championships. How can that happen? And if you looked at last Saturday, what happened across the board, there were upsets across the board. Utah, USC destroying them. A coach has undergone all types of personal turmoil. But the context of that situation, as dismal as it may have been, the outcome was opposite. Volatility becomes exactly the standard. And so the issue is, are we able to collaborate and compete given those unstable situations? If you have been equipped, you can respond like Itzhak Perlman did in that situation. The victory was won long before that. Okay. If you have any questions, I do want to answer them, but I do want to close with this one little nugget. And I do apologize because when I speak, it usually is coming from a place of experience. And this Oklahoma State deal was so fresh in my mind that I wanted to pass along the message that I got out of it to you as I close. And I'll ask that you would pray for those people, because the countenance and the faces there were so far removed from a football field. And I know the loss, having lost a son, I know in between our girls we had one and didn't quite make it. But I know what that feeling feels like. And one of the kids was a 2-year-old under that sheet. And so the sting of that is very real. So think about what you're going to do with the time that you have remaining on planet Earth. Okay? That's what I want us to do. And this is not macabre. No, I hope we're all the believers in this room. But Zoran Kierkegaard said it best. He said that all of us must make noise on New Year's Eve to drown out the macabre sound of grass growing over our graves. It was better when we had hourglasses. The clocks deceive us. But we had to invent them because we needed the deception. For the rotating hands give us the illusion that time goes on forever. And meanwhile, we curse the hourglass because indeed, it is a constant reminder that time is truly running out. You say, Spencer, that's awful. No, it's not. For the person who has a faith and believes in God, they know that we are to be about doing the works which he sent his son to do. He then in turn says, so send I you and you and you. We have a task. We have a role to play. And there's no amount of time that's going to curtail or somehow truncate or de-emphasize the importance of what our role is. Make the most of the time that you have here on planet Earth. That's my admonishment and my encouragement today. So I thank you for giving me the opportunity to share, and thank you. Are there any questions?
I should knock it down anyway.
Anyway, thank you guys so much for your time, and I appreciate you for letting me come share.
Fantastic, fantastic. All right. Our next meeting is next Tuesday. Okay, next Tuesday. Spencer, on behalf of the Tallahassee Quarterback Club, great second time at the Quarterback Club.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
We want you to come back and you get some gray hair.
Yeah.
Okay, for a third. Spencer Tillman, the Tallahassee Quarterback Club, a Yeti felt with your name in the Tallahassee Quarterback Club. Thank you so much for being here. And thank y'all, everyone. We'll see you next week. Come say hi to Spencer. Have a good night.
Thank you.